Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. I hope you're doing very well tonight. Welcome to another spoiler video. This one talking about Endurance, the fourth of 5 elemental incarnations at Mythic Rare. They're part of a cycle that evokes, and the only one we haven't seen so far is red. We're going to talk about Endurance in the context of black-green midrange. Will it rock? I think it will, but I don't think it's something that is strictly better, or even even close to strictly better, just simply because it's so dissimilar to anything that we're already doing. At the same time, I think it's good. I think it's probably the highest floor and the most underrated of these elemental incarnations, at least of the 4 that we've seen thus far, the red one having been not yet revealed at the time of this recording, so there is much to discuss with Endurance. We're going to break it all down for you. Thank you, as always, for watching. Let's talk about this card. Let's have some fun. Endurance is a 3-drop elemental incarnation, 1 gray and 2 green to cast. It is a 3/4 with flash and reach. Now, it has the evoke line of text just like all the other ones in this cycle do, where you can cast it for free by exiling a green card, in this case green. In the cycle it's the same color as the card itself, from your hand. What I mean by it having the highest floor is evident with everything I just said. A 3/4 for 3 with flash and reach is actually a really respectable collection of stats and keywords relative to cost. That's actually a lot more reasonable to hardcast on average than Grief, than Solitude, than whatever the blue one's called, I don't remember, simply by virtue of the fact of it being a 3-drop. This is a relatively low curve card by the standards of this cycle, and flash, reach, and decent stats. Again, we're kind of cooking in a fair sense here. Now, what does it really do, though? We wouldn't really be interested if that's all it does. But the ETB is as follows. When Endurance enters the battlefield, up to 1 target player puts all the cards from their graveyard on the bottom of their library in a random order. So now we are talking, my friends. This is a very useful and very powerful ETB, but one that is perhaps most sideboard-like out of all of the ones we've seen so far, because as mid-range players specifically, and in general, any kind of modern pilot, your game plan is not usually directly advanced, I should say, by putting the opponent's graveyard, or indeed your own graveyard, back into your library, right? That's just not advancing a plan A. What it does do, though, is perhaps hose the opponent's plan A, but that really depends on what they're up to. That said, the high floor of this card, I think, is very, very evident, and also the high ceiling, but in a very narrow way. Because unlike Grief, it's not a proactive form of disruption. Unlike Solitude, it's not an answer that you can expect to be live a statistical majority of the time against the broad modern meta. But this is very, very good at what it does. So let's talk about that evoke. Of course, if you are 2 for 1ing yourself in order to clear out what will usually be the opponent's graveyard, then you are probably against a deck a lot like Dredge. And you know what? You don't really care so much about card advantage against a deck like Dredge. You will be very, very pleased to have the ability to deal with their graveyard for free at instant speed. This is a very, very strong hoser in that regard, and it also reminds me, in that regard, a lot of Ravenous Trap. Now, Ravenous Trap is not precisely a modern staple, because these days there are so many decks that use the graveyard for value and play on a value axis themselves, and there are relatively few decks that are all in on the graveyard, and some of the worst offenders have gotten nerfed with the bans of Faithless Looting and Hogak. But when those cards were in the meta, Ravenous Trap did see a lot of play, and that's because the instant speed, free to cast effect was what was really keeping decks in the game that they would otherwise have absolutely no chance in. And we are seeing the same exact energy from Endurance. And again, it's a little bit of a different thing. You do have to 2 for 1 yourself with Endurance. You do not with Ravenous Trap. On the other hand, Endurance does not have that clause that you have to meet, right? It does not require 3 cards to be be put into the graveyard from anywhere this turn. And of course, a canny opponent under some situations could actually play around Ravenous Trap with that regard. They have no such recourse against Endurance. Endurance also, this effect has one other very important upside other than hosing graveyard decks that go all in. And that, my friends, is beating Mill. We're looking at Fractured Sanity, some brand new Mill tech from this set. Mill is a real deck. You should underestimate it at your own peril. And while it's not a terrible matchup for green-black midrange, which is what we're talking about here, it is a card that it doesn't hurt to be able to just totally hose while you're going about your normal business of trying to compete with graveyard decks, because of course what happens here is with Endurance, you'll target yourself after your opponent has spent many resources milling you, and you'll just put yourself back up to a proverbial 20. You will just say, okay, thanks for spending all of those Glimpse the Unthinkables and all of that mana. Now it's time for you to start all over again. Sorry about that, but that's what Endurance does to you. That's the power of Endurance. But maybe we should talk about a couple of the downfalls of Endurance. So number one, we're talking about green-black rock. It's more of a splash green deck these days, and that hurts us in a couple different ways. Number one, it can be a little bit harder to hardcast. We're not generally set up to accommodate green-green on turn 3. Now, that can be accommodated, but it's definitely something that the average rock deck will have to go out of their way to accommodate. Number two, with that evoke cost, we actually don't have as many green cards as we might like to really maximize consistency here. Again, your mileage will vary based on your build, but that could be a couple different levers that you kind of have to tweak in order to play a card that we have decent alternatives to already. The third downside, it kind of plays off of the second one, is that not only do we not have as many green cards to pitch, the green cards that we do have are less likely to be dead, whereas our black cards are in higher quantities and our higher variants. We're looking at Thoughtseize, we're looking at Fatal Push. Sometimes these cards are best in class, exactly the type of interaction you need, and sometimes they are very bad or totally dead. That's why Grief is so appealing in black-based midrange, because not only is it proactive, not only is it right along the game plan, not only is it very high ceiling and potentially value positive, it also is able to maximize the efficiency of the rest of our cards, the black cards that can be high variance. The way rock decks are structured, that's not so much the case with our green cards, which are more steady, which are more consistent, which are usually, frankly, our threats. And again, if you're against Dredge or you're against Mill, of course you're going to happily 2-for-1 yourself to totally blow out their entire strategy. But it's not as much of a free roll as it might look at first glance. The other thing is, if you're talking about cards like Nile Spellbomb, they already play really well. Obviously, this doesn't really hose the Mill strategy, but it does a lot of work against Dredge, a lot of work against fair graveyard-based decks too, right? And Nile Spellbomb is not even necessarily the greatest companion with Endurance, because you can't pitch the latter to the former. It is all just a little bit, you know, they both would come in, but they don't necessarily work that well together. Leyline of the Void is a card that actually strikes me as more of a replacement for Endurance. If you're thinking about running Leyline of the Void or Surgical Extraction in high numbers in your mid-range deck, it might be a sign that the meta is a little bit warped toward graveyard strategies, and that's when Endurance might be better than those cards, because it has a higher ceiling in terms of the amount of resources it takes away than Extraction, and it is less telegraphed than Leyline of the Void, and also has a higher floor than these cards in terms of being able to be hardcast on turn 3. Even against the linear decks, if your opponent's stumbling, you get a beater down too, and you get to also hose their strategy. Now, talking about that hardcast mode, this is where Endurance actually becomes really appealing again, right? Because should the meta be so warped as to warrant main decking some of these solutions, of course Nile Spellbomb, especially in a Lurrus deck, This can be readily main decked in rock, but certainly you don't want to be leylining or surgical extractioning in the main deck. But you could, maybe see your way to playing endurance main deck. And again, it is not a bad beater. It is not a bad blocker, especially when it goes ambush mode on the opponent's attack step. And then if you think about how it lines up against like control decks, it's not the greatest thing in the world, but you will sometimes get to blow out a Snapcaster, especially early game, and resolve a 3-4. Or you can just kind of play on the opponent's end step, going for that 3-4, getting a little bit of value by cleaning out their graveyard, and maybe forcing permission out of their hand. Then you get to untap and do your thing. Similar play patterns, but for different reasons, can exist against fair graveyard-based decks, value graveyard-based decks like those incorporating Lurrus of the Dream Den. Occasionally, you will be so far ahead due to your opponent mulling or due to your value engines being uncontested that you will be able to tempo the opponent out and 2-for-1 yourself with endurance to clear out their graveyard, right, with Lurrus on the stack, and be perfectly happy with that. More often than not, you'll use it in the way that I just described, where you're hard casting it. You could potentially blow them out on their attack step with a surprise blocker. Even if you don't get to do that, you're just playing a 2-for-1, right? You clear out their graveyard and make it 3-4. It's really not that bad. So that is why my conclusion is that Endurance does rock. It is strong enough, unique enough, and synergistic and on plan enough to see play and rock, but it is not something that you should just cut your Nile spell bombs for without making any changes. Absolutely not. You need to accommodate this card a little bit more, and it might also be not the perfect time for our deck to play this in, for example, the current meta. But after MH2, my friends, who knows? Another card this reminds me of is Force of Vigor, in that the more powerful the format gets, the more powerful it will be. Also, much like Force, you can 2-for-1 yourself to play it early, or maybe 2-for-2 in the case of Force, or you can 2-for-1 the opponent with it if you cast it in the mid to late game. So also the fact that they're more sideboard options than main deck options. Lots of similarities between Endurance and Force of Vigor. So that's my rundown on this card, my friends. Let me know what you think. This is not an exciting ephemerate target, I should say, compared to certainly all of the others, basically, especially Grief. But Endurance, again, I think the highest floor card, the most hard castable card, and perhaps the most underrated one we have seen so far. Thank you for tuning in. Let me know what you think below. I'll talk to you soon.